Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. A few years ago in grad school, I was taking a class called Early American Literature. And in this class, one day we were on the topic of slavery. Because since the settling of the U.S., since the Puritans arrived in the U.S., there has been slavery. And during that time period, there were those who were pro-slavery, and there were those who were against slavery, like the abolitionists. And the professor made the statement that looking at slavery from today's lens, we do not know if we would have been pro-slavery or if we would have been abolitionists back in those days. He said there's no way for us to tell which side we would have been on. And I raised my hand and I said, I know what side I would have been on. I would have been a slave. And then he said, you're not even sure what side you would have been on because not all blacks were slaves. And I said, but I do know that I would have been a slave because I have the slave papers in my family of an emancipated slave. So tonight, what I want to share with you is a copy of those slave papers. I'm going to read the slave papers of my ancestor who was an emancipated slave. So here are some pictures of the original document, handwritten document of the slave paper. So in that document, it's hard to read it, so I got a copy of it that's typed out that I'm going to read to you. But in that clip, you saw the handwriting and you saw the seal of the county of Virginia where these papers were written. Now, as I read these slave papers, I want you to pay attention to the stipulations outlined in these slave papers. So the stipulations are kind of weird, and we're going to discuss those when I'm done reading it. Whereas William Martini, late of the county of Randolph in the state of Virginia, now deceased by his last will and testament, in writing made and published on the 25th day of May, 1847, and admitted to probate in the court of said county of Randolph on the 26th day of July, 1847, directed that at the end of the term of 3 years, during which certain of his slaves should be heard out, such of the said slaves as should have behaved themselves well should by his executor be set free and emancipated. And whereas the said term of 3 years has expired, and the slave herein mentioned, being one of the slaves aforesaid, has behaved himself well, I, John W. Crawford, of the said county of Randolph, in the state of Virginia, now West Virginia, the sole executor of the said last will and testament of the said William Martini, deceased, who qualified as such or assumed the execution of the said will and testament in pursuance thereof, I hereby emancipate a mulatto man, slave, named Jack, about 35 years old, 5 feet 4 inches high, rather light complexion, a small scar parallel with his left eyebrow, above some small freckles on his face, given under my hand and seal his 2nd day of September, 1850, John W. Crawford, executor of the last will and testament of William Martini, deed, Randolph County, to wit. I, John Taylor, a justice of the peace for the county aforesaid in the state of Virginia, do certify that John W. Crawford, executor of the last will and testament of William Martini, deceased, whose name is signed to the writing hereto annexed, bearing the date on the 2nd day of September 1850, has acknowledged the same before me in my county aforesaid, given under my hand the 2nd day of September 1850. Signed, John Taylor, Virginia. Randolph County Court, September 1850. This deed of emancipation from William Martini's executor to Jack, a slave, emancipated, was presented in court, and together with the certificate of acknowledgement was admitted to record. A copy, tester, J.W. Crawford, Clerk, State of Virginia, Randolph County Court, September term 1850, ordered that the clerk of this court register, according to the 6th section of Chapter 107 of the Code of Virginia of 1849, a slave emancipated by William Martini, executor, Jack. A copy, tester, J.W. Crawford, clerk. Register and number of free Negroes and mulattoes registered in Randolph County, Virginia, into Jack, aged about 35 years old, a mulatto man, light complexion, 5 feet 4 inches high, a small scar parallel with his left eyebrow, above some small freckles on his face. Emancipated by the deed by William Martini's executor and admitted to record at September, termed 1850, in the County Court of Randolph, Virginia, and permission granted to remain in this state by the County Court of Randolph County on the 27th day of January 1851. I, tester J.W. Crawford, I, John W. Crawford, Clerk of the County Court of Randolph in the state of Virginia, do certify that the foregoing is a true copy of a deed of emancipation with the certificate thereto annexed from William Martini's executor of Jack, a mulatto man, emancipated, and also a true copy of the registry of the said Jack as registered in this court, given under my hand and seal of said county this 27th day of January 1851, J.W. Crawford, Clerk of Randolph County Court, Virginia, with the seal of Randolph County. Now, the stipulations of Jack, and they don't say Jack Martini. I noticed that in these slave papers, they don't give him the last name Jack Martini. However, from my family records, he adopted the last name Martini as his slave name because my grandmother's grandmother bore the last name Martini. But the stipulations from his slave master is that if he and other slaves, he had other slaves with him, but upon his death, they should remain slaves for the following 3 years and be freed if they behave well. Now, by saying if they behaved well, that's subjective. And that doesn't really mean anything. So it was just left up to if the executor of this will believed that they behaved well, by his opinion, they could be free. And if he believed that they didn't behave well, they remained slaves. So there's no concrete rules. And why would he want them to remain slaves for 3 years after his death? That doesn't make any sense. And if John W. Crawford, the executor of the will, If he wanted them to remain slaves, all he would have to do is say they didn't behave themselves well, so they continue to be slaves. So these types of documents, and this is how some of the slaves were set free. It's just the luck of the draw of who's executing the will, if they behave themselves well. And I also noticed that in these slave papers, register and number of free Negroes and mulattoes. So they differentiate Negroes and mulattoes. And Jack was a mulatto, very light complexion, scar above his eye. So if you have a scar above your eye, I very much do not believe that he was what they say light-skinned blacks for all house Negroes, because I don't know how much housework that you can do that will leave a scar parallel to your eyebrow. But he was a very light-skinned mulatto slave, and he worked. He was a slave. So I told my professor, I'm very light-skinned. I don't have any freckles on my face, but I would have been a slave, because slavery in the U.S. was generational slavery. So if my father was a slave, I would be a slave. And if I'm a slave, my kids would be slaves. So this is the slave papers. Again, here's another snapshot of the slave papers written. Please leave, comment, subscribe. Again, this is Jason Williams with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.